Alright, so today we pick up with Workers of the Nation Unite. And remember I said that the Supreme Court was not going to uphold the Interstate Commerce Act, or not that one, the Sherman Antitrust Act, which would prohibit trusts from being formed that would take advantage of the U.S. public. So the workers were going to have to make those adjustments. Well, the workers know that they're being exploited. They know that work conditions are not that great. Most of these workers in the factories or in the steel mills or working in the oil industry are going to be putting in 12 hours or more a day. They work 6 days a week. They're not entitled to things like vacation days or sick leave. If you went on vacation or if you got sick and were not able to go to work, you could be fired because you didn't show up for work. It's not like you got any days off. Unemployment compensation was not existent at this time. Workers' compensation, if you got injured on the job and you couldn't work, too bad, you're just out of the job kind of thing. And, it's nothing the business or the company was going to do for you. And unfortunately, injuries were very common in these industries. The factories themselves were very dirty. They were poorly ventilated. They were poorly lit. So there's all kinds of really bad things that could happen. Women and children were a part of this workforce. Women and children often worked to supplement their husbands' or fathers' wages in order to make ends meet, because it is kind of tough making ends meet. There's not a lot of money to be made working in the factory. For women, their numbers will double between 1890 and 1910, so just in 20 years, twice the amount of women are going to be in the workforce. Children, about 20% of boys and 10% of girls under the age of 15 are also going to be working. And they are working from dawn until dusk, and there's just not a whole lot of time for school, so they don't get the education that they need in order to be more successful or to get a better job. Eventually, the labor unions will emerge in order to try and make a difference. The National Labor Union is the first large-scale national organization for laborers, and it is the one that will legalize an 8-hour day for government workers. So it only worked for government workers, but it's a start. They're beginning to make a small impact. Another group is the Knights of Labor, and the Knights of Labor was created or organized by Uriah Stevens, and its membership was officially open to all, regardless of race or gender or your degree of skill. It didn't matter. Anybody could be a member. And they also are going to support an 8-hour workday. They also support equal pay for equal work for men and women, so it's one of the first that are going to address that as well. The Knights of Labor will also advocate settlement of disagreements by an impartial person, that if the company head didn't like what was happening and the union rep or the union didn't like what was happening, you brought in somebody who was impartial to settle the disagreement, to come up with a compromise and to talk to both sides. So very, very progressive for their time. Eventually, the union movements are going to diverge or to split up. We will see the development of craft unions, and craft unions include all the skilled workers from a different industry. So you would have your steel workers or your railroad workers or the coal mining. They all went to their own separate, like they split up into their own separate little groups. For example, you'll get Samuel Gompers, and he forms the American Federation of Labor, also known as the AFL. And it's going to focus on collective bargaining, which is group negotiation. Because the idea was that if you went in by yourself to ask for a raise, the company president or whoever is going to say no. But if you go in as a group, like the entire workforce goes in as a group and say, we need a raise, and if you don't give us one, we're probably going to leave this job and find another one, it's more likely that the president's going to say, okay, I can give you this much. So it helps in a way. The AFL will also use strikes as a tactic, and strikes are where you walk off the job, that you refuse to work. You don't get fired and you're not quitting, but you refuse to work. And this is going to help to win higher wages and shorter work weeks as well, because if you get everybody to do it, then you have more of an impact. Unfortunately, some of these strikes eventually turn violent. The Great Strike of 1877, these workers for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the B&O, which, if you play Monopoly, the B&O Railroad actually existed. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, these workers were unhappy. They were striking in order to protest their second wage cut in several months. So their wages had been cut once, and then it was cut again. And again, it makes things hard to do. It makes survival hard. And this strike is going to spread to other railroad lines because of the unfair treatment. The B&O is eventually going to urge the U.S. president, which at this time was Rutherford Hayes, and they're going to urge the president to stop the strikes because the strikers were impeding interstate commerce. Because they're refusing to work, the railroads can't run, and so trade is going to be more difficult between the states. President Hayes is going to agree with that statement, and he orders the troops in to break up the strike. So he orders U.S. troops to go in and break up the strike, and these strikers are going to retreat, and the trains begin running again. So it is actually a success for the railroads on this part, but it won't always be that way. The Haymarket Affair is another major strike that takes place, and the Haymarket Affair takes place May 4th, 1886. About 1,200 people are going to gather at Chicago's Haymarket Square, which is how it's called, the Haymarket Affair. What they're doing is they are protesting the killing of a striker the day before. So the striker had gone, this person had gone on strike, and he had been killed by police during an arrest. And so these 1,200 people are going to gather together because they felt that was wrong. And so the police arrive again, and someone, and it's unsure of who, but somebody tosses like a firebomb, smoke bomb at the police. And the police are going to open fire into the crowd as a result, kind of like a automatic reaction to this. They weren't really thinking about it. But 7 police officers and several of the workers involved in the strike are going to die. And three of the speakers that were kind of in charge of this group of strikers, and 5 radicals who were really kind of stirring up the crowd, are going to be charged with the deaths, with being responsible for the deaths of these people. All 8 of the speakers and the radicals, are going to be convicted for murder. And 4 of them will hang, and 1 commit suicide while in prison. And the others, let's see, that's the other 3 are going to die in prison. They serve their life sentences. But the police begins to turn against the labor movement as a result, because now their lives are endangered as well. So it's kind of, again, another victory for the government, for the businesses. The next strike is the Homestead Strike, and the Homestead Strike is dealing with Carnegie Steel Company. Carnegie Steel had planned to cut wages, and so there's a strike held by the union, and the company president is going to hire scabs, and scabs are strike breakers. They are people who are employed by the company to come in and work the job for the people that were striking. They're not seen, the union doesn't look on them very friendly, like, at all. But the whole idea was to keep the company operating. Well, eventually there's going to be a battle that breaks out between the scabs and the strikers. So as the scabs are coming into work, the strikers confront them, and this big battle takes place, and 9 people end up dead. And so the plant is going, the steel plant is going to remain closed until the National Guard is able to arrive, and the National Guard is going to escort the scabs in, and the union begins to lose a lot of support as a result of that. The next strike is the Pullman strike, and Pullman was a railroad car maker. They made luxury cars, passenger cars for people to ride in. And it is going to lay off 3,000 workers, about half of its workers, and then it's going to cut the wages of the rest by 25 to 40%. And they do that because there was a slight depression going on in 1893. And the workers are not very happy about this. First, you're going to lay off half of them during a depression time, and then the remaining workers, you're going to cut their wages on top of it. Aren't you supposed to be saving money by firing people? And now you're going to cut our wages in addition by 25 to 40%. That's a big chunk. So they're not very happy about that at all. Well, the Pullman company is going to promise that after the panic of 1893, after this depression lifts, then they will hire back 2,000 of those workers, but they're not going to restore any of the wages. Well, they go out on strike because they're not very happy about this, and the Pullman company is going to hire strike breakers, and strike breakers were people who were hired to go in and beat the crap out of the strikers until they went back to work, basically. And so, again, the government's going to have to send in federal troops in order to control the situation before this huge riot breaks out. Now, women were also involved in the labor union or labor movement. Mother Harris, or Mary Harris Jones, Mother Jones, is a very prominent organizer, and her husband and her children had all died of yellow fever, and so she takes up this cause. She supports unions, she supports strikes, and so she's going to lead coal miners into strikes. And what she's going to do is she's going to advise the coal miners to actually stay home and let their wives strike for them, because there was this thought that there would be less violence, that the company won't hire strike breakers to go out and beat up on women, or the scabs aren't going to go out and beat up on women, so there'd be less violence. But what she's trying to do is to expose the cruelties of child labor at this time, that kids who worked in these coal mines ended up with deformities and injuries that were life-changing. She's going to influence the passage of child labor laws, and she continues to work in this cause until her death at the age of 100. So she's very, very active. Pauline Newman is another woman who's very prominent. She organizes the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And she's going to lead a strike that's going to win a lot of labor agreements. But it does not change the working conditions for women in these garment factories that are doing sewing. The conditions finally become a reality to the public because a fire is going to break out in a factory, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and we're going to talk more about this in class tomorrow, the next time we meet. But this fire breaks out in a factory, and the 7th, 8th, and 9th floors are entirely engulfed in flames. And the exit doors had been blocked because the company owners were afraid that union organizers were going to be coming in. So they chained off these doors, and these women are trapped in the building then. They can't get out of the fire escape. And 145 women are going to die. And the public is just enraged when they hear this, because the courts are going to find the company not guilty of manslaughter. That the courts did not find these guys that they were responsible in any way for these women dying. And what this is going to lead to is the passage of fire codes for buildings, that the exits cannot be blocked. A 54-hour maximum work week for women and children, no work on Sundays, and no child under 14 could work in factories anymore. Eventually, the government's going to put more and more pressure on the unions. They're going to want more and more legal action, like the Sherman Antitrust Act. Remember, it had been kind of pushed by the wayside, but the company had to say that a strike was hurting interstate trade, and the state would issue a court order against the labor unions through the Sherman Antitrust Act. So they had to say that a strike was hurting interstate trade, and that the state would issue a court order. As you can tell, there's going to be some more and more difficulty in organizing. The public is just angry that there's such a shortage of goods because these factory workers keep going on strike, and so they're not producing the things they need to produce. So that's going to be a big negative. And then there's also, within the striking union, the unions themselves, a lot of prejudice against minorities and immigrants, and that's going to make it very difficult for them to organize. So we're going to see how this all eventually comes into play after we look at the influx of immigrants into the U.S.